What is going on, you guys? It's your boy, the Senseless Sensei here, and we are back with episode 88 of the video game therapy series. This one's going to be a pretty bad one, just because I am really not in a creative headspace this time, or at least not even in a talkative one. So I suppose we'll see how quickly things get derailed. I'll start with what I think is, I don't know, depending on your inclination, could be a pretty uh, annoying opinion. I don't even know how to say annoying. Annoying is probably the wrong word. Provocative opinion is probably the word I'm looking for here. So the name of this series is video game therapy, but I kind of use that whole therapy designation somewhat tongue in cheek, as any psychological professional probably would not consider this therapy, although they would consider it therapeutic. But I'm sure there is a very distinct and important difference between things that are therapeutic and therapy itself. Like, massage might be therapeutic, but it's not necessarily therapy, or at least someone that works in the industry would not consider it such. Regardless, my statement, I'm not sure, this probably isn't original, actually. I'm sure this is, somebody somewhere has said this, but I don't know if I heard this somewhere or that it just came to me, but therapy is emotional prostitution. And my rationale for that is that it is a paid, one-sided relationship to fill a purpose. And in the same vein, that is what regular, shall I say, sexual prostitution is, just in a different light. It's also a paid endeavor that is also one-sided, in the sense that you're paying for this service, and it is done for a very specific purpose. In this case, instead of sexual gratification, it's just emotional gratification, or maybe not even gratification, but some kind of health thing. Now, I know that is a bit out of context, perhaps, at least in the sense that people don't consider, I guess, selling your body versus selling your mind as anything different. But I suppose I'm also the same person that said that some jobs were just intellectual bribes, which is probably also an equally obnoxious opinion for someone who doesn't consider their work to be demeaning, or at least considers their work to be, I guess, the greatest use of their intellectual prowess, and they wouldn't have anything else better to do, which I would cite as a lack of creativity, but they might cite as something else. So I don't know. That's just kind of my theory. I don't even know if there's much else to be said there, because that's all the defense I have with regard to that opinion. Therapy is emotional prostitution. And one that is kind of related, but it's maybe a little bit more extreme, but that is masturbation being self-rape, which I'm sure that perhaps any rape victim would find a lot of contention with, but that is, I guess, part of the territory when you are saying abhorrent things like me. But yeah, I mean, because I'm sure certainly there is perhaps a more rationalistic part of your mind that doesn't wish to be at the whims of the monkey brain of the one that wants to eat and fuck all the time. And by giving into that, you are, in some sense, being taken advantage of physically by a different part of your brain. Now, again, the brain being all one thing, it's hard to say that there is a line that draws the difference between the animal part of your brain and the non-animal part of your brain. I'm sure there are words for it, which is actually another thing entirely. Having words for stuff. There's a word for anything. Like, I could just, vaguely describe some feeling or opinion of some sort, and like, oh, what you're actually describing is a transcendental neo, whatever. Like, I don't care if there's a fucking word for it. My issue with people that just have words for everything, or have heard a word for something, is that it makes it sound like you understand it, right? And I realize that there's power in assigning words to something, but then kind of dusting it off and saying, oh, we're all done here. There's a word for this feeling that you have. In German, the word is blah, 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 blah. It's like, I don't give a fuck what the word is in any language. It doesn't mean that you have solved it. You haven't cracked the case, right? Just because you have a word that describes some kind of vague human feeling doesn't mean shit. If anything, it's just, great. Now, how do I define that word in terms of other words that might mean something? Or how do I, just having a word for something doesn't do anything, beyond that. But regardless, I'm sure there is a word that defines a stronger line between monkey brain and intellectual brain, or whatever you want to call it, smart brain, or I don't know, economically useful intellectual brain. Um, but I don't care if there's a word for it, but it's ultimately all part of one brain, and these limits are artificial. It's like even words themselves are artificial designations of an object, right? I can point to a dog that I've named, Snickers or something, and like, the word itself, Snickers, it to me means the dog, I guess, or the snack or whatever context you're thinking about. But it itself is still it's a dog, right? And even a dog is just the word we have to describe this furry animal of this, general shape. I'm sure there's like a genetic argument. Sure, there's like certain DNA sequences that we've corresponded to certain animals, but those are also just arbitrary. Like it'd be perhaps more accurate in that sense to define things by their specific DNA, genome. So we're listing off, gDNA, like we're listing off their giant, or their a CSV or whatever of their things as the most accurate representation of themselves, which is again cumbersome and probably over the top. But even then, it's still an arbitrary assignment of something. It's not an absolute. So my intention, I guess, I'm going with here is that I don't think just because you have a word for something means that you understand it or describe it any better, right? Even like I can have the word for like tranquility or equanimity where there's like this, I don't know, this profound contentment, and not a lack of ambition per se, but a profound contentment with the way things are. But that'll never really convey the feeling in itself, right? And perhaps this bleeds into a little bit of this artificial intelligence and whatever is that, again, a robot could define, or I guess I'll say a robot, but sure, I can just say robot just to be generic, but an artificial intelligence, which I have contention with that word anyway, could, define very accurately or even just describe using very, illustrious Mark Twain-esque writing of what those, tranquility or equanimity means, but it doesn't really, we'll never really feel it. And I suppose you could say something as stupid as like, well, it doesn't know what love is, or how do I know? It's just describing it so perfectly. But describing something and feeling something is an entirely different thing. I think this is where the importance of consciousness and awareness enter the discussion, right? Because I can use my language, and so can the robot, to describe a awareness or understanding of a concept of some kind, but that is wholly different from feeling it anyway. It's like the feeling of victory, right, or of achievement is not something that a language generator can do. Even if it can describe it perfectly, will never feel it. Even if it is able to pass the Turing test and convince us that it knows what it feels like. You can only do that through its mediums of text, which again is not really a real test uh, of feeling. So I don't know. I think we have to develop some kind of test for consciousness, which I don't know if it's possible to do that. Because even something that even we wouldn't argue is alive or is conscious, even like a monkey or a dolphin or something, I'm sure that we can say that these things are conscious and aware because they have some kind of working memory, and I don't know, they emulate all the parts of consciousness that we do, and they're not automatons in that sense. They have some kind of uh, I don't know, autonomy or just even randomness in their affairs that don't necessarily point to it being, computable. But is that is that just random movements in our consciousness? It's like, well, no, we can't even really test for that then. So how do we know, right? And perhaps something that we might not say is conscious, but is certainly alive, would be like a plant or a tree. Is that thing conscious? Many would say no because we don't really know. We have no way of communicating with it, right? We can communicate with, I guess, more physically able-bodied organisms like monkeys and things through patterns and handing them stuff and even making noise. Like we are able to do that, like dolphins and stuff. But besides of like this physical, I guess, verbal in some sense means of communication, we don't know what that is. That's proof of intelligence in some sense, and then proof of things further down the chain. But even something that we're not able to prove is intelligent, like a tree or something. We can't communicate with that using anything other than, I guess, physical stimuli. So many would argue that's not conscious. But I don't know. I think we would need a stronger test for consciousness. Now, I think it'd be a joint effort between physicists, biologists, and philosophers of some kind to really drill down about what consciousness is. But it's also possible that there is no infallible test of consciousness. And in any way we design some kind of test would be a fallible representation of consciousness. Because we're not really sure what it is ourselves. We can, I guess, define it as some kind of emergent property from collections of neurons or of something similar, but then, maybe then perhaps we're only counting intelligence that emerge from, having brains or neurons. And are brains a prerequisite for consciousness, right? Are there things that don't necessarily have brains that we would look at and say those are brains to be conscious, right? Perhaps there's some, I don't want to sound like a fucking idiot here, but perhaps there's some higher dimension in which trees or whatever operate that they don't have brains, of course, but they have some kind of hive mind, right? And even like ants of some kind, maybe they have brains, I don't know, but they don't have like, the physical mushy brains. It's like they have but they still embody some kind of hive mind behavior where we would take one ant, looking at one ant, or like this thing is very insignificant and is perhaps a very computable thing. We could, create a little robot that would emulate what an ant does, but there's certainly something hive mindish about what ants do that they don't really make much sense to us. It's like, well, they seem to be working together, but individually they're not anything significant. And I think looking at humans, you could say, well, that's what kind of God is among us. If there's a bit of God in everybody, and there's God is kind of there's a bit of God in all of us, is that kind of theory. But in the same sense, would there be kind of groups of trees sharing some kind of hive mind that we wouldn't really be able to measure by looking at any individual tree, or much less even having some kind of means of communication. Like, how do you communicate with a colony of ants, right? It's clearly not English, or even physical stimuli wouldn't really make much sense, right? We can put food down, but that doesn't really give us any form of advanced communication. In some sense, it's impossible. Regardless, though, is there an argument to be said that there is colonies of ants are conscious in some sense? I don't know. I think it'd be a very, very interesting rabbit hole to go down. That would be at the intersection of all these different sciences and kind of non-sciences in terms of art. But I don't think philosophy is necessarily a non-science. Here's one of my abstractions on philosophy and why it's so interesting to me, and not because I think I'm a philosopher. I think it's kind of a misnomer. I don't think any real philosopher is going to run around and consider themselves philosopher. I think it's kind of it's its own way of doing things. But in everything that there is, so I'll say in every item or activity or really any kind of thing or any action or of any kind, it may or may not be inherently, we'll say mathematical as an example. So like, a math problem is, sure, that's inherently mathematical. Even like physical properties like gravity, inherently there is mathematics involved in gravity. But everything it has a inherent philosophical component. So even if something like a math problem on a sheet of paper may not have, isn't inherently biological in nature, which it's not, it's a math problem. I guess you could abstract it to the biological components of the paper or the ink on it. Everything has a inherent philosophical component to it, even if it isn't something as an outright philosophical question. That's kind of my argument. I'm not saying that this is a fact of any kind, because we're kind of throwing all that out the window, but everything is by nature in some sense philosophical, but not everything, I would say, is inherently a physics problem or is mathematical or is biological or is sociological or psychological in nature. Like, some things are not psychological in nature. Again, a math problem would be a good example. It would be hard to argue that a math problem is like deeply psychological in nature. However, I would say it'd be trivial to argue that it perhaps is. Am I putting the wrong? I totally am. It is inherently philosophical. in some sense of like you could always kind of ask why. I guess the easier way of framing this whole thing is that you're always able to ask why. You can always kind of dig deeper into the why, and then eventually you arrive at some existential conclusion. But the point isn't just to see how fast you can get to the existential conclusion on the why. But the fact is, there's always an avenue to ask why. Why is always a fair question. A fair, not necessarily a practical question. Most of the times it isn't a practical question. So, for the math problem example, why am I doing this? Well, you're doing this to pass a test or something. And then again, these become impractical, but you're always kind of allowed to ask why. Whereas, which is this philosophical inheritance to any idea or anything. Whereas you couldn't look at everything as a math problem. Some things aren't a math problem, or at least aren't one that's computable by our brain. So like, does this girl like me or whatever? That's not as much as these nerds might want that to be inherently mathematical. It's not, right? And there's no way of calculating that. Even if it was, perhaps maybe you believe it to be inherently mathematical. There's no way of you computing it in real time. However, you could entertain the question of, why do I like this girl? Why do I want this girl to like me? Or why do humans like each other at all? There's always like these questions that can build that have philosophical nature to them. Whereas not every question or every abstraction on top of something have, a biological, sociological, psychological. That's not always that component. And I'd say the closest to this always having a philosophical component is a psychological component, because many things are psychological. I think most things are psychological in nature in some sense. But there's certainly times where the line between the psychology of it and the philosophy of it are kind of blurred, and more or less we're bickering over the semantical differences, but that otherwise describe the same phenomenon, which I would argue is more philosophical, not psychological in nature. But regardless, I think that's the interesting thing about it to me, is that everything is philosophical in nature. There's nothing that's devoid of philosophy. And you can strip things of their philosophy, and that's fine. You're allowed to do that. I think many people have to do that for certain things because it gets annoying. I mean, if you always look at the philosophical reason behind why you're working or making money, like at a retail job or something, you're very quickly like, well, this is dumb. I don't even want to do this anymore. But so you have to kind of ignore sometimes those difficult questions. And at that point, it becomes just a matter of practicality, which I've already said it goes out the window when you begin going down the rabbit hole of philosophy. But either way, I just think it's interesting that everything has this inherent philosophical component. So I will move on to something else here. Let's see. Yeah, the conscious and the subconscious mind. This is another, I guess since I'm talking about psychology here, there's a interesting theory that I don't know, that's not really postulated by any prominent psychologist, at least maybe people have talked about this in different ways, but this is just me thinking about it. It's not necessarily something I'm riffing off of. But we have, suppose for argument here, I'm not going to debate about the specifics of the mind, but suppose we have some conscious and subconscious mind, right? We have this material mind and the immaterial mind, or there's two different versions of that. And so we could abstract different bubbles of like subconscious, the dream subconscious, the semi quasi subconscious, whatever. You can make, these are all fake abstractions. It's all kind of one thing, but suppose for argument that there's two kind of separate parts, and they can mean whatever to you that you want them to mean. I don't really care about that. Perhaps one way of looking at the subconscious mind that we might encounter during dreams and, subliminally in these kind of impulsive moments where we just have to react, and it's more instinctual than it is perhaps, thinking based or anything conscious. It's just more subconscious reactions to things. The subconscious is responsible for digesting what the conscious mind eats. So if you look at it like a stomach or a feeding organism in some sense, the conscious mind is responsible for kind of consuming material, right? Kind of basically putting stuff in the mouth of the brain and then chewing it. Which then feeds the subconscious, which is responsible for digesting and kind of reevaluating or restructuring parts of the brain. And one perhaps conclusion from this abstraction is that part of our unspoken malaise or difficulty in dealing with the modern world is that we don't give our subconscious enough time to digest all that our conscious mind consumes, right? Whereas I think more prehistoric humans or pre-industrial humans had a lot less that was filling their conscious mind on a given day, at least less of real volume. Maybe it was more of a balanced diet, perhaps. Whereas now it's more of a gluttonous diet, and we're kind of drowning our subconscious in different things, asking it to do a lot more. And we're also we're so quick to dismiss the impact of subconscious artifacts on things and putting more emphasis on the conscious mind, and that everything is these decisions that we make and not necessarily more instinctual responses that are managed by the subconscious, that our brain is overloaded in more sense. We don't give the subconscious part time to digest and create, I guess, healthy instinctual responses. Or instead just kind of bloated or constipated, I guess, to look at it that way, with all the crap that we put in our mouth via the conscious mind. And this is all metaphorical, of course. I'm not talking about, I could make the actual physical argument about eating too much too, but this is more of a consumption in terms of what our eyes, ears, and brain, what our senses absorb via the conscious mind, which I think, is again, I think is one useful potential abstraction on what the subconscious mind is. It's not just, it's so easily dismissed. It's just like, well, we don't believe, understand it, therefore it must be pointless and stupid. It's like, well, that seems a little arrogant, doesn't it? Like, oh, we don't understand dreams, or like, why we sleep beyond just like recovery or something. So, and no one's here to say that sleeping is not, everyone says that sleeping is important, but they tend to want to make rational arguments for why sleeping is so important, or why. And my argument around it is that, again, using this abstraction, that perhaps it's when the subconscious can digest all the food we ate, during the day. And I think that's maybe what dreams do too, is some amount of subconscious processing of what the conscious mind eats. And again, but I think the problem is that looking at sleep as some rational physical, process in which is, again, overly conscious in nature and not necessarily something unexplainable and they're, unconscious too, that it is, it's, again, slows down digestion by the subconscious, given that we're putting too much emphasis and power and importance on the conscious mind. Which I also think where perhaps like religion or religious-ish type thinking, you don't have to necessarily be like, a pagan or something, or have a Christian or Buddhist worldview. You don't have to have a specific God in mind to have a religious reverence or sentiment of some kind. But I do think that religiosity, to use that word broadly, has a lot more subconscious appeal than perhaps our overly material and rationalistic world is now. And perhaps that is also part of our unspoken ways. And again, these are just more theories. These are also very rational theories. These aren't necessarily ones that have this very explainable. It's hard enough to have theories on stuff that isn't science-based and peer-reviewed. You just sound like a kook spouting about nothing. If you just, and then also you can just peddle any product and sell anything if you're just, there's unexplainable reasons for why you feel about it. It must be deficiency of this rare vitamin that was now in this one mix that we found and we're going to sell. But I don't know. That's stupid. I'm rambling about nothing. But it is interesting to think about the delineation between the conscious and subconscious mind and the potential ramifications of dismissing or at least underplaying the importance of subconscious mind. Also viewing it as like a stomach and mouth type system where if you overflow the conscious mind with stuff, and perhaps that's why people need like intellectual rest. It's like, why is it physically that we're not able to like focus on something for that long, or spend every waking hour on something, quote unquote productive? Like, why is there just like these inherent periods where like our brain just doesn't even work? It just stops working after a while. Like, you think, biologically we can like look at chemical responses and say, oh, we just need more dopamine or whatever. You can look at that and then, like, I guess, take drugs to fix it or something. But surely there's a bit of the subconscious that plays into that as well. Like, why can't we just why can't we just wake up like a robot and spend 14 hours staring at the book and reading the book and like absorbing it and being max focused. Again, dismissing this biological argument, we just look at chemicals that impact our focus. Yeah, but again, perhaps looking at this more conscious versus subconscious mind, giving the subconscious time to, where the brain feels that, in leisure, it feels empty, but in reality, it's just the conscious mind is kind of off. You're awake, you're conscious, but the subconscious part of your brain, I suppose, is the better way of putting it, is processing things and is creating some kind of response. Perhaps that's one other, I guess, explanation for why we can't just sit down and grind all day, and there is a kind of exhaustion that comes with intellectual exercise. And there's certainly ways of like naturally improving the time your amount that you can spend conscious, but at a certain point too, you don't want to be. I think there's some unhealthy balance too. Like even if I was able to, game my body and being able to focus for 15 hours a day, I think there would be ramifications subconsciously in the sense where I'd be starving my subconscious brain of time to, I don't know, ruminate and focus on kind of not, I mean, not focus consciously, but be ruminating subconsciously on whatever it is that my conscious mind has been absorbing. So again, very, I'll say wishy-washy and very word salad-esque tones, but this is me trying to articulate a very, very difficult concept. So it's just kind of the best I can do, I guess, at this point. But it is interesting to think about that as an abstraction on the mind, because it is. I mean, it's like there's. I guess it kind of reminds me of this difficulty in like we are rational, like we're capable of being rational, but I think you'd be a fool to say we're capable of being rational all the time. I think rational, at least in a, I suppose in like a, not necessarily in a moral sense, even in a moral sense too. Like there are things that we know are morally incorrect, but there's some irrational, instinctual part that kind of overtakes that, and we can rationalize that. And most of the time we just rationalize it to like, oh well, it's just our monkey brain wanting to do that. It's not anything. It's not our true, smart, moral, rational brain. But I think there's also a part of, irrationality and morality that is governed by a subconscious part of our brain, not necessarily the conscious, maybe academic type rational, where it's more this spiritual kind of God-esque rational, which again appears irrational to our rational mind. So anyway, I'll move on to something perhaps a bit less abstract, because that is a little ridiculous. So I don't know. Let's see. Yeah, this is an unpopular opinion. I know it is, but I'm just gonna say it anyway. I don't really, I mean, I kind of get on one level the obsession with space travel, of like exploring and kind of filling up the box that we're put in. So in some sense, if we put, a biological organism into a box of some kind, and again, this is kind of a metaphorical box, but it has this natural desire to like want to spread to the contents of the box and explore everything, right? It's like the bacteria will grow to the size of its container. It'll only stop when it can't grow anymore. I know that humans also kind of have that same sense, where it's like, okay, we grew to the entirety of the Earth. We're no longer, nomadic, and we can go anywhere. But now we want to grow even further to other planets, right? Even if that means a lot of us dying because we aren't meant to go other planets probably, in the same way bacteria that maybe grows into a part of the, I don't know, the petri dish where it's poisoned or something, I don't know, would not be able to go. They'd retreat after a while. Clearly, our little meaty bodies were not meant for space travel, but it is some kind of childhood, maybe even subconscious desire that is interested in going to space. But I don't really get it. I don't think that, I don't know, maybe I'm just not as in touch with this childhood whimsy of wanting to go to Mars and stuff like that. Our planet is great. I mean, we've conquered the entirety of Earth. It is far and away more beautiful than other planets and more livable for us already. I mean, it already produces air. It gives us food. Everything we need is already on here, and we know how to do it. Like we don't need to like figure something out to live here. We're doing fine. We've kind of figured out how to live here anyway. But now it's like this. Besides it being like an interesting engineering challenge or like a hypothetical question, of how to live on Mars, but like, why do we need to live on Mars? Like, we even know even how to make life here renewable, whereas there we'd have to start from nothing. We have stuff here already. We already have trees. We have food. It already grows here. Water just flows on the ground. But yet we have to like we'd want to go to Mars to then have to like make all this up from zero. How would that even make anything easier? I just don't understand, even from a survivalist perspective. I don't see why it would be better, faster, more fruitful to go to Mars. Because even like the political argument, like, oh, well, there's too much politics here. We can't get it solved here because there's too much messy politics. And on Mars we could start from like, no, it wouldn't. The people who would get there to set everything up would be just we would bring all of our flawed political ideas and opinions and history over there just to ruin it again. What makes you think it'd be this utopia? Like, why would it be any less corrupt politically than the planet we're already on? But this planet at least has trees and water, and we can breathe on there. And it's not 5,000 degrees or whatever it is. I guess it doesn't make any sense to me why you'd want to travel. I think as a novelty part, it would be. And I think we can keep sending robots over there. I think that's fine, just to explore and kind of fuck around. But for the rush of like getting our meaty selves over there, makes no sense to me beyond a childhood fantasy. Which again, people are allowed to realize their childhood fantasies, but it's a childhood fantasy at the end of it all. It's not, I mean, it's like having a robot girlfriend always sounds great, but the implications of that beyond like a 10-year-old thinking about it for 5 seconds are terrifying, and always is a bad idea. You don't want a robot girlfriend that does everything you want. Just for the betterment of yourself and for a life well lived, you probably want somebody that doesn't do everything you say all the time. Is not just a sex slave pretty much with robot parts that are exchangeable and you can't shut them on or off all day. Like, not to say that an annoying nagging wife is part of the good life, but there's a lot beyond just like these childhood ideas. There's a reason they're childhood ideas and that they fade, and there's smarter things that take over and they replace these. I want to go to space and be Superman. I want to fly. It's like there's a lot of implications from that you probably don't want. And part of it's just, I don't know, humans have conquered a lot of artificial barriers, and so it's very easy for us to get very ambitious with conquering more artificial barriers. The barriers of space, which seems like a pretty, if I were designing a kind of an Earth or a universe where I'm like, all right, you guys don't leave this area, I'd probably put a giant void, unbreathable, unlivable void around other parts, and then every other planet would be devoid of life and anything. That's what I would do. I would just, instead of making it everything black, I'd put a few things out there to keep things interesting, and then for the most part, make it pretty obvious that we should relegate this life to just that planet, right? You shouldn't be going anywhere because nothing else is anything you need. It's like one thing if Mars kind of looked like Earth, like if it looked like Utah everywhere, or even Nevada, or even if it was cold or something. Like at least there'd be like maybe there's water and like plant life or something somewhere. There's nothing. It's all dead. There's nothing alive anywhere over there. Why? What is the fixation with going over there then? It doesn't make any sense. The same fixation with this, robot girlfriend, robot wife. It's like, I don't think you'd want that, right? It'd be cool. You'd be over there and be like, after 10 minutes, you'd be like, oh, fuck. I kind of feel unsafe here. This just kind of feels empty. I probably should, go back home. I should probably get a real living wife that I can argue with, Not to say that you should be arguing with everybody all the time, or that that's part of what it is, but I think there's a lot. I guess I'm more naturalist in that sense. And I suppose I also didn't look up and better define naturalist versus humanist, but I imagine the humanist would say, well, we need to go to space. We need to conquer the rest of for what? Then, okay, we conquered Mars. There's no one even over there. There's no one even over there to like flex our guns at. We're just flexing our guns to what? Other countries or other people like on our planet. We're already on the same planet. We're not impressing anybody over there. No one's giving us a challenge. It's not like if we get to Mars, there's like maybe there's like, is there a natural resource over there that's really abundant? Are the rock kind of useless over there? Is there like oil or something? Even that, it's like there's just so many other solutions that make infinitely more sense than to ship oil or ship whatever using rockets from Mars. Like, what the fuck are we doing? Unless we invent wormhole technology, it seems kind of pointless to do any of this. So I don't know. That's just kind of my I still don't, I don't really get the space fixation beyond it. Again, beyond kind of an extension of a childhood whimsy, I want to do this, whatever. So I don't know. It just seems it seems like we're too akin to our biological instincts in the same way that the bacteria wants to grow in the petri dish as much as it could. Even if it does grow out too far and die because it's not meant to grow that far. We're kind of, again, not using, we're thinking too biological for like, oh, we need to get out in space. Whereas we have a perfectly inhabitable planet we have right now. And even if like the problems that we have aren't this like limited, but the problems we have are sociological, right? The problem is we can't deal properly with each other, and we've grown to a size where we now weaponize technology instead of like making it, largely beneficial for humanity in some degree. I'm not saying 100% of technology is to humanity's downfall, but no, I'd say there's a certain percentage, a toxic percentage, perhaps, I don't know, 10 or something, 5, perhaps a growing percentage, perhaps 5 to 7 year over year, um, of technology that's kind of against, used politically or sociologically against other humans, which isn't in line with a peaceable, it's much more biologically, I want to survive, I'll kill you kind of thinking instead of a more appreciative naturalist perspective. And I know that conflict is a natural desire of humanity. I'm not saying that humans all of a sudden are just going to wake up and be Bob Marley smoking weed and be peaceful all the time. There's certainly a natural outlet of conflict that is evolutionarily hard coded into our biology. It's not like we can just. That's half the reason that we can't. Let's have world peace, man. It's like no one's ever going to do that because whether we like to admit it or not, we like murder. I'm not saying, and I'm not saying in the individual level. I think most people will denounce murder, but in the aggregate, there is conflict and violence and hard ass, metal ass nature inside of all of us. Whereas dudes that watch a lion murder a deer or something, it's like there's some dude that's like, fuck yeah, look at that shit. That rules. And that's literally just murder, and in the wildlife, and we like that shit because we are animals. We have that animal instinct. So like to act that it'll just go away because we, go to school. Like that's not how it's worked. We're still gonna hear those lower biological impulses. It's the same reason people can't just not overeat and get fat. It's because they're still listening to those, animal instincts of nature's metal. That's fucking cool. That mountain lion just tore up that turtle or something. I don't know, whatever it is, but that's like we have this natural desire for conflict, and it results in wars. Now, I guess the dumb part is what kind of, and hopefully it's not a nuclear war if we run into that, but there's still kind of inevitability of conflict. We can't just remove conflict forever. The natural state of humanity has been conflict of some kind. Now, in this case, it's instead of it being, I guess, just bombing or shooting people, I suppose I'll take like this information crisis or whatever, information warfare or something. Whatever it is that these Marxists are spouting about as being, the next war, the next. I'll take information warfare using the internet, over a nuclear war where there's bombing and shooting people. And I guess unless you're looking at the Middle East crisis, I guess that's more physical in nature. But I'll take this, I'll take the information internet warfare because you can always just unplug and go outside. And then, as far as you're concerned, there's no conflict at all, right? You can go outside, you can spend a walk in a park in, rural Kansas, and there's no war anywhere. I mean, look around. This is just the epitome of just not conflict. Which, I guess you can forget about. So I'll take that over just bloody battles every day and ripping apart children for food or something like that. But regardless, I think there is still an innate biological desire for conflict, and we need some kind of healthy outlet for that. Now, because you're not going to neutralize it, right? As much as we want to like try and get the video game violence out of kids and like, but like there is some natural itch there. How do we itch that in a way that works, but a way that's also not just murder? It's not Purge, right? I think like the Purge movie kind of gets that part right, where it's like, oh, everyone needs a day to like unleash or whatever. And violent video games probably give some people some kind of outlet. I think, for the amount of murders it might cause, it probably saves a lot more murders than it actually causes, right? As much as parents want to hate violent video games, it's like, oh, he made my son a murderer. It probably saved hundreds of thousands of kids from being murderers. And the fact that they were able to throw a grenade at a pretend Soviet in, or, Modern Warfare 2, instead of actually, stabbing the person in their class with a Swiss Army knife. Like there's a huge argument made that video games have saved more lives of violence than it has actually caused. Now, of course, we don't have the data on what's it saved because we can't do that kind of double-blind experiment. Which is the other thing of like data and stuff that pisses me off. It's like everything needs to be data-driven. We have to have these like data reasons for everything. Well, it's like even if most data is impossible. Most data is gone and is impossible to measure accurately before, during, or after the fact. So like even if I said, okay, the number of lives we've saved through using video games as a violent outlet, instead of murdering slaves or chopping people's heads off, public quarterings like they used to have, we now have Call of Duty. It's like I don't know how many lives it saved, but we could argue all day that it's never done anything. People have never used it as an outlet for violence, or that humans are not inherently violent, which would be a ridiculous argument to make. But like we're never going to have that data, never. So it's just your instinct versus mine, your words versus mine. And so whoever sounds more compelling or intelligent is going to win this argument is dumb. Even so, let's suppose we had some data on this. Like, I don't think people realize even the non-objectivity of data itself. Like data can paint a picture. It can paint a picture like an artist. But much like artists' work are entirely interpretable by the viewer, we can also just look at the same graph of data and come to wildly different conclusions. Based on normalizing data, aka removing data points that I don't like, or rescaling data, aka softening the blow of data that might be too harsh. It's like we can do all kinds of stuff with data. So in the same way that you can look at an artist's painting and reinterpret it in 5 different ways that make the artist out to be a genius, a moron, or a killer, we can do the same thing with data. You just look at it, you interpret it the way you like with your glasses, however you see it, and then you write up this giant thing, and if you sound compelling or convincing enough, people will believe you and reshare it, or if it is popular or Harvard funded or something, then all of a sudden it's, fact of some kind. But to act like data itself is this infallible source, give me a graph of data and see I'll show you what I can do with it. I can make ridiculous arguments on that. I'm not saying there's not generally a story to tell in the same way like someone's not going to look at a painting of a ship and go, well, this is obviously a bamboo tree. It's like, well, no, it's not. It's a painting of a ship, but like debating the nature of the ship itself would be more in line with what I'm talking about. Like, yes, we can look at a general trend but like, the type of ship, there's lots of debatable parts about the painting of a ship. Was the painter angry? It's an angry painting. Like, we don't know. We can kind of interpret things as we like to see them, but ultimately it's still our flawed, biased interpretations of things that ultimately become these data-driven facts. So it's just my frustration with people over-venerating data and science. And again, I hate to always sound unscientific, but I think that's what science is constantly being skeptical of our approaches to things. And I'm simply being skeptical of this over-reliance on data. And not a sense not to say we shouldn't use data at all, but we should understand that it is kind of like looking at a piece of art. And we can interpret it. We can have art critics that interpret it similar ways. We can also have people that might be more right from the outside that interpret it a different way. It's not to say anything in particular about the data itself or the art, in whatever case you want to look at it, but it still is different people have different interpretations. They put their implicit bias on whatever they're looking at. It's not necessarily always a black and white thing, even with data. Because that's kind of the thing is people look at, well, the data says this. It's like, okay, well, let's take a closer look at the data. And then also, it's also fitting that a bunch of people now, or a bunch of researchers now, are getting ousted as making up data or fabricating it, or massaging it a little bit for certain things. And it's like, oh, who would have known with financial incentives at play and an overly political academic system are getting people that defraud or are fraudulent in their work. It's like, yeah, how is that surprising? You guys stupid? I've been kind of saying this the whole time, that it's not, with kind of malaligned incentives, it creates, I don't know, creates problem. It's not, you can't have this objective system. It's like the morality has to kind of defeat the incentive structure, which is very difficult for humans to do, overly rational or not. So I think my whole argument around it is to kind of understand the limits of rationality. And it's not that I am anti-rationalist. I just think there are very clear, obvious limits to human rationality. And we should be very aware and very careful with these limits to kind of dance around them and to live in harmony with them, not necessarily be over guided by them. And that's kind of perhaps my main beef with society at large today is that it's over guided by a hyper rationalist viewpoint on things. Which hyper rational, I'm just being emphatic in my language there. That's just rational. I'm saying hyper rational in the sense that everything has to be some rational answer, or there can't just be like, I don't fucking know, maybe, or oh, God did it. I don't know. You can just say God did it, and that's kind of a catch-all or something. Why did he get brain cancer? I don't know. It's not up to you. Just live with it and move on. You can't do anything about it. Whatever, There's always this very fight to explain everything that happens, which I think is just a symptom of our arrogance. I think I wish people in general are more, not humble in the sense of not, celebrating achievements, because we can certainly celebrate humanity's achievements, and there's been a lot to celebrate, but there's certainly a lot that we should kind of bow our heads to, right? I think that is in shorter supply now than ever, and it's also a result of a lot of our other issues, is that the inability to bow one's head and kind of admit and I guess let higher powers take over or whatever, just kind of let their fallibility show is problematic. Yeah. Anyway, I'll move on to something else, probably equally as pointless. Yeah, I suppose the other part with, I guess, humility in some sense is spending a lot of time ruminating, talking to myself, obviously, creates a bit of this. Is honesty with oneself. I talked about the conceptual integrity last time, and how with one person you have up to 100% conceptual integrity. But a lot of people, I would argue, are very not honest with themselves. And I think that manifests themselves in a lot of, I guess, modern mental illnesses or other neuroses or weird coping habits or drug use or whatever that people find themselves leaning on more and more because their inability to be honest with themselves in the scheme of things. Both around other people and kind of this, I guess, honesty in terms of where they stand socially, but also honesty with themselves and what they believe and what they think, or the biases and things that they have, or even just beliefs that they know are irrational but they hold regardless, but they can't come to terms with the fact that this is an irrational belief that is looked down upon by their family or society or whatever, and there's kind of that difficulty with that. So my thinking is that I've come to terms with perhaps a lot of kind of other strange beliefs and other things, some of which I've articulated in these videos, other of which I haven't, but I think I've come to a conclusion that, for better or worse at least, in some sense, by some standard, I have to be some kind of evil person. Not evil in the sense that it's like, maniacal evil, or that, evil driven by, overt selfishness in some sense. But there are, I guess, evil tendencies within us all. And I'm very quick to recognize where I might have had evil beliefs or something, or at least beliefs that seem evil to society at large. So either I'm just this evil person who has fucked up thoughts of some kind, or everyone else is lying and is, very good at putting on masks of hiding their intentions and their true beliefs about things, which I am more honest with myself about. And I think I don't think I'm necessarily evil per se, at least comparatively. I would err on the side of people being more dishonest than me, because I read people, and I think Nietzsche is a great example. Really, any philosopher that spent a lot of time thinking about themselves, they often come to, again, conclusions or thoughts or ideas or articulations of innocuous ideas that are very sound evil, or you can make them out to be maniacs or people who are truly evil and are deserving of whatever. But I think that's not evil. It's honest. And I think the deeper you look and the harder you kind of probe yourself, you realize, oh, okay, maybe I'm not this like perfect, great person. I'm kind of this I'm kind of neutral, and there's influences in one way or the other, and I'm not free from anything, vices or virtues that anyone else, like, I'm very fallible, and sure, maybe that makes me evil in some sense, but I also don't think that, I'd argue most people are just so dishonest with themselves and so, uh, I guess, so devoid of interest in self-actualization or questioning that they can just try to gaslight themselves in their existence, that they're not, no part about them is this, could be this potentially quote unquote evil person. Now I'm using the word evil here pretty loosely. I don't think necessarily that I'm like this like Hitler evil person. I think this, me being brutally honest with yourself about a lot of things, um, you maybe you arrive at things that are, again, aren't necessarily, you really come to terms with how fallible that you are as a human, and how, perhaps how shitty some of your opinions can be, and how, maybe parts of your opinions or beliefs are a bit fucked up when compared to the measuring stick of society, which I don't think is necessarily a fair one per se. But yeah, really the dichotomy is either I'm an evil person or people are just lying or not very honest with themselves. And I don't think I'm that evil. I don't murder people. I'm not a criminal, at least in a legal sense. I suppose I'm a criminal of thought. Or FBI agent has the unfortunate task of watching the 4 days of of me rambling to myself. But regardless, I don't think necessarily that I'm evil. There is kind of that inkling that I get from hearing myself talk and think about different things, and be brutally honest with myself that I only think other people who have ventured to that depth have only ever had the, I'll say, privilege of going up against. So I don't know, it's just kind of interesting thought about, I guess, how honest one person is with themselves, and I guess where that develops into their beliefs and their different, I'll say, neuroses and other compensatory mechanisms in which they deal with their innate evilness, I'll say, but or just their, I would rather say just their fallibility, their moral fallibility, perhaps, because I think fallibility in one sense is like a physical fallibility, but I mean their moral fallibility and conflating that with being evil. I'm kind of putting those in the same bucket in this case, but coming to terms with my moral fallibility leads me to believe that I'm either much more morally fallible than people, or people just dishonest or just lying, or just don't have that true honesty with themselves, and have even less honesty with the people around them, the world. So that's my belief. I'll wrap it up there. But anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.